Good evening, everyone. Yes, I invited my family as my renter crowd in case nobody showed up. Okay, so I want to preface this talk with two things. Firstly, I'm going to cover a lot of time and space, and I simply don't have time to talk about everybody that has done work here. We had a workshop, for example, 5 years ago, and 50 people came to that working in the Serengeti, and that was just in the last 5 years. In particular, therefore, I just want to mention my team of Tanzanians, Simon and Duma, who was my PhD student and then continues to run my program, and now he runs all of the wildlife research in Tanzania on the left there. And I have a team of others, and Ali Kwabi and many others who are continuing to work there. But of course, there are many others than that. The second thing I want to say is, there's no way I can tell you everything that's happened in the Serengeti in just under an hour. So I'm going to have to pick and choose a few stories. And essentially this is a story, or a series of stories. And I'm going to jump from one thing to another just to vary it a bit. And also because I don't want it to be overwhelmingly science, I want to have a few other sort of stories there as well. So that's basically what I'm going to try and do. Firstly, though, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take you on a journey across Serengeti, a journey that no tourist will see, and certainly what you wouldn't see on the television. What we see in this in this map here is in the southeast of this map are the crater Highlands. These are old volcanoes of about 4 million years ago, and in the far west you will see Lake Victoria. And we're going to do a transect, a very quick transect, across from east to west to show you what the Serengeti really looks like. The crater Highlands produced dust that blew westwards, and that created the shortgrass plains. Those shortgrass plains are formed because there's a hard calcareous hardpan there that the trees cannot get their roots through, but the grasses will grow on top of that. The important thing about them is that they're very high in nutrients. Some of those volcanoes are still, or at least one of them is still active today. And out of the plains rise the Gold Mountains, places which tourists would never see. In the far east, we have the shortgrass, and then as we go westwards, west along the plains, about 60, 70 kilometers, we get into long grass plains because we're getting further away from the volcanoes, and the soil is getting deeper. And at the edge of the plains, we meet the mountains, and at the mountains, we also meet the trees, which is the beginning of the savanna. At that point, the trees can grow because we're now far enough away from the volcanoes. The savanna covers the rest of the ecosystem, west and north, and of course we have more hills, and interspersed with open grasslands, kopjes, rivers, and the main river is the Mara River, which comes down from Kenya and through the Serengeti into Lake Victoria. And this is the most important river in the system because that's where the wildebeest go to get their water. It's the only permanently flowing river in the system. These rivers drain westwards and they support tropical forest and eventually end up in the far west, again, where tourists never see that, which are floodplains, and these floodplains create the estuary into Speke Gulf of Lake Victoria. And this lake, the third largest lake in the world, is so large that it creates its own weather. And as a consequence of that, we have a gradient of rainfall, and that is what drives the Serengeti from dry sea, very dry, semi-arid country in the south and the plains, the shortgrass plains, 400 millimeters a year, to 1,200 here in the west and north, where we get rain nearly all the year round. Of the animals, I'm going to just give you a very quick review to give you an impression. The main player in this story is the wildebeest, which goes out onto the shortgrass plains if it can, but it only does so when it rains there. And when it gets there, it forms large masses, and they stay there feeding on the growing grass as long as it is green. As soon as that finishes, they then move westwards, at this point forming dense masses into the woodlands where they're looking for water. Also migrating with the wildebeest are zebras and Thomson's gazelle, and then there's a whole diversity of other herbivores. Grant's gazelle, very closely related to the Thomson's gazelle, buffalo. Two types of antelope here, in case you hadn't noticed. Hartebeest called Congoni, and another one called Topi. Waterbuck, reedbuck, steinbuck, dik-dik, grey duiker, oribi, klipspringer. And that's only some of them. There are actually 28 in all. The greatest diversity of ungulates in the world. Similarly, about 15 species of predators: hyena, leopard, cheetah, wild dog, golden jackal, various mongooses. So, there is an even greater diversity of birds, 640 species. That's greater than all of North America combined. 180 species of butterflies, 100 or so grasshoppers, and so on. Enormous diversity, and the reason is enormous mosaic of different types of habitats. Now what I'm going to do is tell you the story, because it wasn't always like that. 40 years ago, when I first went there, we had just got an indicator that things were changing. Buffalo and wildebeest populations were going up. And the question was, why? We knew almost nothing about African animals at that time. So, to answer that question, I have to take you back 120 years or so to what is known as the Great Rinderpest epizootic, or epidemic. It was a viral disease which got into Africa when the Italians invaded Abyssinia, or what is called Ethiopia these days. And they brought with them cattle, and those cattle were infected with a virus called rinderpest. Rinderpest is the origin of measles. Measles, in fact, jumped from cattle into humans back 10,000 years ago, I suppose, when humans and cattle lived together. And it acts just like measles. So animals like that are related to cattle, so these are called ruminants, will get the disease as juveniles, and they'll either die from it or they recover, they get antibodies, and they're safe from that disease for the rest of their lives. But it had never been in Africa before, and therefore all populations were vulnerable, and it caused a catastrophe on the same scale as the Black Death of Europe and the smallpox of North America in the beginning of the 1500s. We know that something like half the human population of Africa must have died. This is completely unheralded. Very few people know that event took place. It also knocked out the ruminants that were related to cattle, apart from the cattle themselves, which most of them died, causing tremendous starvation amongst the people. Buffalo, which is the closest relative to cattle, they also died out, and others like the wildebeest. That disease then continued to spread. It took 5 years to go from Ethiopia to the Cape and to West Africa. It covered the whole of Africa. After that, it then continued as waves of epidemics through the continent every few years, every 10, 15 years or so, from 1890 right up until the 1950s. We were fully aware of that disease, and it seemed to be something that we had to be looking at. So one of the first things we did was to take blood samples from animals, and the vets had also been taking blood samples way back from the mid-60s back into the mid-50s. They had luckily stored those samples. We had the records of which animals had antibodies to this disease. I had the skulls of those animals, and I was able to tell the age of those, and therefore calculate at what age they were getting or not getting this disease, because I was able to match them that had the antibodies with their ages. And what this slide shows is that animals born back in the 50s here this is the percentage of the population with antibodies. 100% of them had antibodies. Same with wildebeest, and then all of a sudden it disappeared. Disappeared in 1963, 1964 for these two species. Why? Well, the vets had approached the disease of rinderpest by getting rid of wildlife, because they considered that the wildlife was infecting the cattle. And they did. They eradicated wildlife all over Africa until they had kind of isolated foci of the disease, one of which was Serengeti. They actually did contemplate eradicating the Serengeti. This was in the 1940s, but by then conservation finally started to raise its head, and people said, no, you can't do that. And so they said, okay, second best thing, we'll put a ring of inoculated cattle around Serengeti. And they completed that by 1963. This was to contain the disease in the wildlife, and the consequence was it died out of the wildlife, and it told us, the vets got the story upside down, that it was the cattle infecting the wildlife and not the other way around. What happened then, of course, was that the survivorship of the babies doubled and the population took off. So this is how we imagine roughly what the wildebeest population would have looked like. We have no idea, of course, where it was at that point, but somewhere up there, collapsed, slowly increased in the presence of rinderpest, and then it took off rapidly. Then the wildebeest took off rapidly. So that was the big change, and you will see how that change has shaped everything else in the system. Okay, so the next question is, well, if it's increasing like that, what would stop it? Was it the food supply? As I said, I'm zipping through things that took us about 20 years or more in about a minute. We didn't know anything about these animals at that time. We didn't know what they ate, and we had to go and you go and look and see what they ate. Well, buffalo in particular were extremely timid, and all you saw was a cloud of dust if you got it within a mile of them. So we realized we had to go and capture some baby buffalo. And that was hazardous enough as it was. But once we got them back at the stable, they were extremely fierce. They knocked my legs out under me. Until I fed them. I fed them milk from a bottle, and one feeding, and that was it. After that, I was mother, and these buffalo followed us around everywhere, into the house even, if we left the door open. They were perfectly happy to be with us everywhere. And when we went for walks, they came along too. There was only one snag about it, though, and the snag was that in buffalo society, babies follow their mothers. And that's the way it is. So when Anne and I, my wife Anna here, went for a walk, then the buffalo number one, one's older than the other, would horn her out of the way. And then the second buffalo came along and horned her out of the way. So we had to walk in line astern, me, buffalo number one, buffalo number two, followed by Anna. And that was the way we went for walks. But when I wasn't there, they were perfectly happy with her. So we had to go and measure food supply, and we had to measure the food supply in the same way as these animals fed on the food, which was particularly cumbersome. We had to sort of pick it with our hands, just to give you an indicator of what sort of things we got up to in those days. And this is 27 years of data to show you the important thing here is that this is the amount of food per animal for the wildebeest, and what you see is that over the decades it went down and down and down. And the reason it went down is because the population was going up, and so the amount of food for each individual was going down and down, to the point where they started to starve. The old ones and the young ones were starving, they were dying off, and eventually the mortality rate equaled the birth rate. And it leveled out. And it stayed like that ever since. And as simple as that. They ran out of food, and they leveled at that point. And there was one dip here, which is the Great Drought in 93, and they picked right up again afterwards. So that's the answer to that. I could have told you about predators, but I got too much else to talk about, so I'm going to leave that. But basically, predators will eat these animals, wildebeest, they'll eat buffalo, but the proportion that they eat is trivially small. They can only take less than 20% they count for less than 20% of the mortality. So, essentially, it's a story of food. Okay, so, likely you are asking, well, it's famous for its migration. What causes the migration? I'm going to just quickly zoom through here. February, May, wet season. They're in the southeast here on the plains, so that's the population there. Early dry season, June, July, they move westwards. August to October, dry season, they're up in the north and in the Kenya side. So this is the Kenya Mara Park, and this is northern Serengeti, and I want you to remember this bit here, okay? And then they come south again, November, January, to the very southern part of the park. So that is the migration, what's called a migration. The reason for it is that they're heading to the eastern plains. So when it rains there, because as I said earlier, there is there's a very high nutrition, and in fact, by being there, they fertilize those soils. The dung beetles come in and they bury those soils within a couple of, they bury the dung within a couple of minutes and recycle that nitrogen extremely fast. So the whole thing is a self-promoting process. The wildebeest go there when it's wet. When it's wet, the dung beetles can operate. They bury the dung, and so we get this very fast cycle. However, they can't stay there because there's no water there. They can only get the water out of the grass, and as soon as it dries out, that's when they start to migrate. And the second aspect to this story is that predators can't follow them. There are predators everywhere, but they're stuck there. So for most of the year, the predators don't have the wildebeest there. They're only there for part of the year. Therefore, the predator numbers are limited by whatever else is resident in their territories. And the predators can't migrate, and this applies to all predators, and it actually applies everywhere else in the world as well, is that they have young which they have to look after, and in this case for the lions, they can only carry them around, and that means they can't move the great distances that the wildebeest can. Contrast that, baby wildebeest can run within an hour, can run as fast as their mother within 24 hours. So, two things that cause a migration. One is they have access to temporary but very good food, so that inflates the population, allows them extra food. And secondly, they can escape predators. So those two things combined cause the migration and allow the population to be very large. Okay, I'm going to take time out now from the science and ask this question. So, how did the Serengeti all start? The Serengeti as we know it, the Serengeti as a national park, a conservation area, the number one World Heritage Site in the world. How did it all start? Well, it's not what you might think. In 1891, Oscar Baumann did a trip through its German territory. It was German East Africa in those days. Here's his trip. This is the park boundary as it now stands. Okay, it didn't, of course, exist. He went up through here and the roundabout and so on. He covered most of the area. The important thing was he was a social geographer. He was interested in people, and he produced a map which said, "This is where the people are." The hatched areas. There were no people in the park. Never were. The people, the modern peoples of Africa, were the Bantu that came from the Congo in the 1700s, only about 300 years ago. Before that, we had hunter-gatherers, and they roamed the courts for hundreds of thousands, probably millions of years through this whole area. But they weren't living, they weren't structures, they weren't residents. The modern agriculturalists coming from the Congo arrived on the eastern shores of Lake Victoria in the 1800s and didn't move any further east than here. On the eastern side, we have pastoralists. They arrived even later. They didn't arrive until the 1850s, and that is just 20 years before the first travelers, European travelers, came through the area. So that's the first point. Nobody lived there. Nobody modern lived there. After the First World War, still no protection, nothing, no legal representation for the Serengeti. It became the playground for rich hunters from North America, especially. There are quite a lot of them. I'm going to just talk about Martin and Oza Johnson because they actually were they were the least of the problems. Nevertheless, they were hunters, and they went out there to do two things, to hunt and to film. Most of the hunters didn't even bother to film, they just went shooting. And they shot. And they would shoot 30, 50 lions at a time. Unregulated. This is Oza Johnson in the amphibious plane that they flew out there. And the common practice was to go and shoot a topi or a zebra or something and drag it behind the vehicle. In this case, they dragged it behind this plane. And then all the lions showed up, and then she could get a film. On one occasion, unfortunately, they forgot to shoot something, and of course the lions were now had become trained to recognize this plane as a source of food. So when they couldn't find the food on the outside, they climbed in on the inside, and she had to bang them on the head with a bag of flour to deter them. But she hunted just like all the rest. Well, by 1929, one person in particular, Dennis Finch Hatton, who was a professional hunter, and you may have remembered the name from the film Out of Africa, because he was the lover of Karen Blixen. And he was so incensed with this hunting of lions, this massacre, which they did by dragging an animal past a pride of lions. They were in a car, and they'd shoot things from the car. He was so incensed that he wrote a letter to the Times and highlighted all of this and embarrassed the British government, embarrassed the Tanganyika government. And they sent Julian Huxley, who is a very famous evolutionist, to go out and assess this, and he was really the first conservationist. And he and Dennis, between them, wrote a report which said you've got to preserve Serengeti, and actually one park in each of the countries, Uganda, Kenya, and Tanganyika, and that was the Serengeti for that one. And so, eventually, they set aside a small area which is in the dark. This is the dark area here. Again, this is the modern boundary of the Serengeti, this one here. That's what they set aside as a protected area for the lions. Note, no mention of wildebeest anywhere in this story. In fact, they hadn't a clue about the wildebeest. They knew that wildebeest appeared and disappeared. They actually thought they came from Nairobi. They didn't know where they went to. If you think that the Serengeti was preserved because of the Great Migration, it was lions. That situation prevailed. This was a lesser form of protection that they'd set out. It didn't actually amount to anything. And that was the case until 1950, when it was formally declared a national park, and that, again, is the dark area here. So it's a long, thin, east-west oriented protected area. There was a problem, though, which is that half of the area, this half, was inhabited by pastoralists, the Maasai. And that simply did not conform with what people understood to be a national park. So in the mid-50s, they said, we're going to have to realign the boundaries here. And they appointed my father as the chairman of that. He's a judge. And they set about trying to redesign it. The first thing that he did was to bring in an ecologist from London University, and he had to do the best he could, which wasn't. It was difficult because nobody knew anything. So eventually they decided they would partition the Serengeti, and here was the boundary that they put in place right across the plains, and this is where the Maasai were, and there are no Maasai in this area over here. And then, to compensate the park for losing half of it, they added on this bit up here for the reason that nobody lived there. No other reason. Well, remember that bit I asked you to remember earlier? That's where the wildebeest go in the dry season. That's the biggest stroke of luck in conservation history. Because if we didn't have that, there would be no Serengeti now. So, we might have lost an important bit of the plains, but we got the most important bit of the Serengeti. And that is how the boundaries lie today. So, the park came because of lions, and the boundaries are set by luck. Okay, back to what was going on in the Serengeti. The trees were disappearing in the 60s and 70s, and again, we were trying to find out why. And initially, and all over Africa, we found that elephants were knocking over trees, and therefore, since they were knocking over trees and the trees were disappearing, elephants were to blame. And in fact, in many parts of Africa, they instituted culling regimes to kill off the elephants to save the trees. In South Africa, Kruger, for example, in Uganda, in Zimbabwe, and so on. However, some of my colleagues had a feeling that this was not right. Here's the evidence that things did change. It's not a good photograph, it's the best I can do. But it's in the Mara Park, far north of the Serengeti. These two little hillocks here, and all of this sort of dark area, that's trees. And the photo is taken from another little hillock. 40 years later, I went to the same place, re-photographed. 2 trees left, just... Trees are gone. This is the Mara Park. So why was this happening? Well, it turns out that there were a lot of fires, grass fires. And these fires were burning as much as 80 or 90% of the Serengeti every year. And the consequence of this is that they burned back the baby trees, the things that grew probably up to the height of this table here. They didn't kill them, it just got burned back to ground level again. And when that happens, of course, there's no escapement. They can't replace the adult trees. And eventually, you get a distorted age structure of the trees. Adult trees and no baby trees. And over time, then those adult trees die of old age, and then you don't get anything. And that's what was happening, and we found, as I said, this collapse, and this is, if you like, acacia canopy cover. That's an index of the number of trees, and you see they collapsed in the 1960s because they were all of the same age. I'll come to that. And so they all died together. So it was fires. It wasn't the elephants killing the big trees. It was the fires killing the baby trees. And then the wildebeest kicked in because they ate all the grass, as we know, as I've told you. And when they eat all the grass, you can't have fires. There's nothing for the fires to travel along and burn, you're just little patchy fires. And so we see the area of the park that is burnt plummeting down in the 70s here. And what happens? Well, prior to this, I thought we'd better set up some scientific monitoring stations to basically create the requiem for the trees, the last of the trees. And all over the Serengeti, we set up what we call photo points to do this in 1980. Now, I should also put an aside here and say, I'm telling you a glib story that is smoothing over all of the facts. The facts were that I got the story wrong nearly every time. And this is a good example because we were losing the trees. Now let's have a look at one particular site. Every site showed the same. Here's 1980, big trees, no regeneration. 86, we're getting a bit. 91. 2003. The trees came back in an abundance that we've never seen before. We didn't lose the trees, we gained the trees, we had an outbreak. We could even go back further with using some of those Hunter's photographs. These are Johnson photographs, and I can find the same places. My family helped me do this. It was detective work trying to find these locations from way back in the 20s. But here's one site. And of course, they were only interested in the lines. There's the line. I was only interested in the trees. Trees by the 80s, no trees here. By 2000, trees back again. One more thing, though, is these trees are completely different from these trees. We have a complete turnover of the community of trees. And I can tell the ages of some of these trees, the big trees, and we can plot when they all started, when they were born. And essentially, all of those trees were born together in the 1890s, 1900s, after the Great Pest. So it was that event which shaped the whole of the woodlands, the savanna of the Serengeti. So, simple answer is wildebeest reduced the fires, allowed the regeneration, trees came back, and we're talking about a time scale of about 90 years. So that's how we have to think about things changing on those time scales, not on the time scales of 2 or 3 years. Unfortunately, that story is not true either. Because in the Mara, we still didn't get any trees. And remember that rather poor photograph of 1944? That's the evidence. Lots of trees, so we know they can live there, but still no trees coming back. Here's the last of the big ones. And there was no fires any longer because the wildebeest were up there in the dry season eating it all, and that's when the fires are. So no fires in the Mara, no baby trees. And that's when we have to come back to the elephants after all. Remember, I disposed of the elephants. Well, now we got back to the elephants because one of my students, Holly Dublin, did some work did something that nobody else had thought of doing, which was to watch elephants and see what they ate. And what they ate was, I'm pointing at the wrong screen here. Look here, a baby tree 6 inches high, and here, and here. And here, and they're going along, grabbing it, kicking it with their foot. They're weeding out all the baby trees. And they're in sort of line abreast, and they clean it out perfectly. So well, no trees can survive. No baby trees can survive. So, although elephants can't change a savanna into a grassland, once it becomes a grassland, they can keep it there. It's called a change in state. Okay, now, if that's the story, then how does that explain Serengeti? Because we got trees, and we had elephants. But we didn't. Because in the Serengeti we had the great ivory, the great mortality of elephants in the 1980s, where we had a catastrophic loss of elephants throughout Africa, well, most of Africa. We lost 80% of the elephants. But not in the Mara Park, which was under much better control, much smaller area. Kenya was much better off, had more money. They were able to look after the Mara so that the elephants survived. And here's the track of the population. Poaching kicked in a big way here in the 70s and 80s. The elephants collapsed here. And whereas in the Mara, we didn't see that collapse. In fact, we got even a little bit extra because elephants moved into the Mara. They know where they're safe. Not all of them, of course. Most of them didn't make it. They were killed all. That means that we lost the elephants in Serengeti, and the trees came back. Didn't lose the elephants in the Mara, and the trees didn't come back. And if you look at the boundary of Tanzania and Kenya, there's no barrier, no fence. Tanzania, Kenya. That is the history of elephant. Okay, well, that explains that, but we're not finished yet. Because there's another aspect to this elephant story, which is they were increasing in the 50s. I don't know if you remember seeing that, so I'll show it to you again. Here, like this. What were they doing, increasing at that time? To answer that, we have to go back 150 years to the great ivory trade of the 1800s. And this story comes from the records of the slave traders. And I actually read those. This is Tipu Tip, very famous for anybody who knows the history of Africa. Great slave trader. But in fact, what all of this was about was the ivory trade. Because they sent out their minions to go capture people who were to act as porters, to bring the ivory to the coast. As in this wonderful photograph from the 1800s. And then having got these people, they're in shackles, having got them to Dar es Salaam, or thereabouts, it's called Bagamoyo, then they said, well, what do we do with these? And they sold those people to Arabia and to India. So that was what the slave trade was about. It was the ivory trade. And that ivory trade was so extensive that it cleaned out elephants from Africa, with just a few exceptions, a few odd spots, like on the Nile, for example, and elephants disappeared. Here is the record of the ivory imports to Britain during that period. You can see that fairly level, constant to about 1840, and then rocketing up here, and that's what cleaned out Africa. Oh, by the way, why were they doing that? It came after the Industrial Revolution, and people were getting richer, and they were all able to buy pianos and billiard tables and ivory-handled knives. The wealth from the Industrial Revolution, which was led by Britain in the world, created the demand for ivory, which changed the ecology of Africa. And I say that because what happened is that with the absence of elephants, a whole set of trees were able to grow up that would not normally have been there. And then, when us colonials came on the scene, we saw Africa covered in bush. That was primeval Africa, wasn't it? It was Africa without elephants. And so when the elephants finally, after long decades of protection, started to increase again, then they started to actually do what any animal does, browse down on their food and change the whole structure of the vegetation, which was where we came in on this story. They saw elephants knocking over trees. So only by understanding the history here, going back all of this time, can we actually put the story together and make real sense of it. But now, so I should mention that in 1988-89, the CITES, the Convention for the International Trade on Endangered Species, put elephants on the endangered list. It's called Appendix 1, and no more trade in ivory. Elephants have responded hugely, a very high reproductive rate, and now very large herds of elephants. Unfortunately, this whole cycle appears to be starting over again. Now we're seeing more and more reports of massacres of elephants as the ivory trade is opening up again. Okay, time out. What was it like to live there? In the early days, we did a lot of camping, and we found our campsites tended to be accommodating a lot of other things as well. And this was the late breakfast because we had to wait for them to move on. One night, Anna rolled against the edge of the tent, and she woke me up and said, there's something leaning against me. I told her not to move, and I went back to sleep. In the morning, we found it had been a leopard. Brought the family there. Some of them are here now. And they helped us do the carcass, look at carcasses, measure carcasses, do autopsies. We were doing burning experiments with Holly Dublin. It's very dirty work, this. We had to burn fire breaks here. We came out absolutely black. Anna, here's Holly, Alison. I took the photographs. Homeschooling, that's how they did their work. And now we have a house. This is a house that my very good colleague Peter Arcese managed to get for us in the centre of Serengeti at the Research Institute, because we had our own house. This part of this story I can't go into, that we had a different place, and it was captured by bandits. And, well, they all escaped, but we couldn't stay there. So we got this house, and we've had this now a better part of 25 years. We have a nice garage here where we have our fleet of Toyotas, veranda here. We like to sit on the veranda and watch the wildlife. We see just about everything there. And I want you to just notice this rather poor, it's hard to read, but it says Serengeti Biodiversity Program. You'll see it better in the next slide. So we shared the place. One day, early in the morning, I went outside at dawn. It was not very easy to see, and I walked straight into 37 lions. They were busy killing this buffalo, except they couldn't. And the buffalo suddenly discovered that it was a great place to be in our garage. And there he stayed. And there we stayed in our house. And because he was injured, he wasn't in a good mood, so we had to let him, leave him alone for a few hours, actually. On another occasion, I was out on the plains camping by a kopje, and I was actually following zebras, and it was again at dawn. I was standing outside my tent, having my coffee, and I saw some things walking towards me, and I realized at the last second that it was a whole bunch of lions, and I jumped in my vehicle, and they plunked themselves down by the tent and looked like they were ready to stay. So I thought, oh, well, I'll go off and do my work, and I'll come back later, and they'll have gone because it'll be too hot. Well, I came back later, all right, and it was too hot, and they were sitting in the tent. And it took me forever to get them out, and there they are up here. But there was still one hanging around here. I just could not get out of my car without this thing snarling at me, coming down, and I couldn't understand what the problem was. But every time I made an attempt to get into the tent, got really excited about it. And then eventually, this took a good hour, she got up, went round behind the tent, and pulled out 2 babies. Thought I was going into the bush behind the tent, because she didn't know the difference, to get her babies. Okay. Finally, does the park protect species? Well, yes, because we also work outside of the park, and what we find is that rare and endangered species, local endemics and so on, disappear outside of the park. Africa-wide species do just fine outside of the park, but it's the local ones. Now here's an extraordinary arachnid I've never seen before. In fact, don't know what it is. It's about 1 centimetre. Butterflies, study those. And the rare endemics drop out as soon as we go outside. Birds. The rare endemics, there's about 14 of them in Serengeti, drop out as soon as we go outside. Vulnerable species disappear outside. Vultures in Africa are in free-fall collapse, just as in India, only for a multitude of reasons, but as much as 95% of the vultures have gone outside of parks in West Africa, 60% in East Africa, and about 80% in South Africa. We're trying to get this published now. The only places you get them now are inside the parks. Top predators, we find, disappear outside of the park, like the raptors. Almost no raptors outside the park. Lots inside. And the consequence of that is that there are rat plagues outside of the park, rodent plagues, lots of species. And of course they create problems with grain crops. Insectivores, birds that eat insects, they drop out, not all of them, but we lose about half of them outside of the park. Consequence is insect outbreaks outside of the park, in agricultural land, on the crops. And, in contrast, seed-eating species like these birds, which is this well-known one called the red-billed quelea, they have a wonderful time outside of the park because not only are there the crops which they like, but there are no predators either. And then they form colonies of 1 million nests or so. So, does the park protect species? Yes, it does. Rare species, problem for conservation, disappear outside. Predators, the loss of predators result in pest outbreaks, and that's a problem for society. So the park really does have a function. So to end here, I will just ask this question, and there are three answers to this. What have we learned after 50 years? Firstly, I think you gathered from the various stories and different ways of looking at it and so on, is that we've seen everything changes. Habitats change, animal species and their populations change. And that's from just the time I've been there. But if we can look much further back than that, because we can go to Olduvai, which goes right across the plains, and where Mary Leakey and others have done her work, 4 million years. And we can look at the habitats that used to live there. And what we see in that site, which I'm just going to show you again, is short grass plains here. What we see is that it was once woodland savanna, and it has gradually changed over the 4 million years until now it is grassland. It has been constantly changing for the whole time. And it's not going to stop now, it's just going to carry on changing. So that's a very important point. The second thing is, what I ended up on, is protected areas are necessary for conservation because they have to preserve certain things that can't exist without it. Migrations, rare species, predators, and so on. Now those 2 points mean the third one. The way we do our conservation is to draw a line around an area. It's static. And lawyers say that's the way it is. And you can't change it. Well, nature's not going to go along with that because everything is changing. And that means habitats are going to move out of that boundary, species are going to move out of that boundary. And if we can't adapt to that and be flexible, then all of the parks are going to change. They're going to have something, but it's for sure not going to be what you started with 200 years later. So if we want to preserve such things as the Great Serengeti Migration, which is unique in the world, then we're going to have to change the way we do our conservation. This work has been largely supported by NSAC for the last 35 years or so. Canada can be proud of being, I think, responsible for looking after this place in terms of getting the information which has been extremely valuable in helping the managers to preserve it. And I just simply mention that if it wasn't for this information that we had, they would not have had the ability to contradict the politicians who wanted to put a road across the northern part of the Serengeti and cut it off. But all of this is now going to stop. That money comes to me, and I'm going to finish, and there will be no further information unless we can find a way of funding it. Now, I should emphasize that the Tanzanians themselves simply have not enough money to do that, and they will not put any money into this sort of thing. All of that money has to come from outside. So I just end by saying, until we can find a way of doing that, and at this point I have not found an answer, a solution to it, unless we can set up a trust fund from which we live off the earnings and maintain this monitoring of populations, it's all going to stop. Thank you very much.